Alright guys, so let's talk about Japan and their big bond dump because something incredible just happened. When you're an ally of the US, you probably feel that you deserve special treatment. The US is free to punish China, they can punish Iran, they can punish Russia. But the last thing you can imagine is for the eye of Sauron to cast its gaze on you. And with Trump coming back in 2025, he doesn't discriminate. The new US economy is going to punish everyone. Countries all over the world, even G7 allies, are going to face hell. In Germany, for example, this leads to the destruction of industries. The US raising trade barriers means you have to build stuff in the US. To sell to American consumers, you better build factories on US soil. As horrible as this sounds, the situation is actually worse for Japan, and the timing is incredibly horrible. Growth is slowing down like never before. For the last 5 quarters, GDP has been more or less flat. This doesn't bode well for Japan, which is supposed to be a manufacturing giant. This is the land of Toyotas, Nissans, and PlayStations. And because of this slowdown, the government is about to unleash a big stimulus package. Japan's going to throw money at the problem, which could make the inflation problem even worse. At the heart of this issue is the collapsing currency. Because of their crazy debt levels, Japan is trapped. The BOJ can't seem to raise interest rates without imploding either the private economy or the national debt. And the problem keeps getting worse. Household spending in Japan has fallen for the second month in a row, and this makes it impossible for the BOJ to take action. The traditional method of raising interest rates to suppress demand is gone. The yen is heading towards 160 to the dollar and will only get worse as Trump starts his trade policy next year. And you'll quickly understand why the currency is under enormous pressure. It's set to buckle even further in 2025. As a result, Japan is dumping US Treasury bonds like never before. They sold a record $62 billion in Q3 this year, and that's $10 billion more than China. And this sell off isn't over just yet. Clearly, Japan isn't against the US and they're still the biggest holder of US bonds, so why dump now? The case for China is very simple. Beijing wants to de-dollarize because of the trade war and US sanctions. That much is crystal clear. Japan selling their stash of US bonds is all about currency protection. They are desperate to shore up the collapsing yen, and this sale is from a position of weakness and not one of strength. And this distinction is very important here. Remember what Trump is bringing with him in 2025. He has pledged to slap a 10% tariff across the board, so imports coming into the US would get more expensive. Now, for Japan, this is horrible news. As a manufacturing economy, Tokyo has to push out their exports to the biggest consumer in the world. The situation is already horrible under Joe Biden. In September, exports to the US fell by 2.4%. The country is exporting even less without a tariff war. In addition, Japan posted a trade deficit of $2 billion in the same month. They are not exporting enough while imports have been driven up thanks to the weaker yen. The problem Japan faces is similar to Germany. The cost of labor is very high. The cost of energy is also a very big problem. A third of their energy mix comes from expensive LNG. And when you face a big competitor like China, the only way for Japan to survive is to sell to the US market. The tariffs are going to drive down demand even further. And before you say it could never happen to Japan, it already has. This is a gotcha moment for the entire Japanese economy. The United States has raised the import tariff for Nippon steel. Taxes for hot rolled steel are going to skyrocket. It's going from under 1.4% to nearly 30%. The US wants steel to be made in the US instead of importing lower cost options from Japan. Now, does this hurt the consumer? Yes. At the end of the day, the cost will trickle down to other industries like the auto sector. But remember, the US doesn't care. They have the biggest consumer market in the world and they are weaponizing it. Donald Trump has always been hostile to the idea of Japan buying US steel.
And I will stop Japan from buying United States steel. We have a foreign country that wants to purchase one of our greatest. If you go back 70 years, our greatest company by far was United States Steel Corporation. That was the big deal. And now we have Japan buying it. They shouldn't be allowed to buy it. We have to make it work. They have to make it work. You don't want to sell U.S. steel.
The deal with US Steel is a foreshadowing of things to come. Trump, he's going to ring fence critical US industries, so good luck for any foreign takeovers, even if you are a G7 ally. It's not just against China. He's basically trying to emulate the model of Chinese manufacturing, reindustrializing the US to ensure critical industries and manufacturing companies is all done back in the US. Now, this is horrible for Japan because now their trade surplus with the US is going to dwindle further. Since 2021, Japan's balance of trade has been downright horrible. It went from a surplus to a deficit peaking last year. And unlike the US, Japan cannot afford a big trade deficit. The larger it gets, the more dollars are leaving Japan. And to acquire more of the reserve currency, Japan has two options left. Either they let the yen devalue even more, which, what do you know, it pushes local inflation up, or they sell off their reserve of US bonds to acquire the cash. Either strategy will be quite painful. But Japan has a bigger nightmare coming in 2025, and this will also result in a bigger sell-off in their treasury holdings. Overall, this is going to deindustrialize Japan and things are about to get really, really ugly.
Finally, to exploit these pro-manufacturing policies, their full potential is going to happen. It's going to happen very quickly. I will appoint a manufacturing ambassador whose sole task, and it'll be a great one, will be to go around the world and convince major manufacturers to pack up and move back to America where they want to be. They want to be. For years, we watched other countries steal our jobs. Now we are going to be going after their jobs and bringing them back to America where they belong and where, frankly, they want to be. They want to be.
So you heard the man. He's going to appoint a manufacturing ambassador to clobber countries one by one. And the most vulnerable will be industrial countries with little bargaining power. And we're of course talking about Germany and Japan. Those are the top two on the list. The US is reverting to mercantilism or protectionism, same thing. By using the size of the consumer market, Trump wants to shift Japanese jobs back to the US. And remember how Japan is currently faring in China. They are losing the fight there as well. Competition with BYD is eating them alive. Their biggest car brands are losing market share and earnings, they're all plunging hard. Profits for Toyota have dropped tremendously in the first 3 quarters of the year, from $8.3 billion to just $3.7 billion. The rival Nissan has announced massive job cuts. They're going to lay off 9,000 workers. Meanwhile, Honda also reported a 15% fall in operating profit. If this is the situation today, just imagine how bad things will get if US puts up their trade barriers. Automakers in Japan will be forced to lower prices to get their exports out, or they'll have to move production all the way to the United States, which is what Trump wants in the first place. So it's deindustrialization in Japan or lower profits. Either way, GDP will take a hit. We are starting to see this happen. Toyota is planning to open a new EV battery in North America, and this is how important the US market is to Japan. Competing with China globally is nearly impossible. So they have to move production to a market that excludes Beijing. And we can further confirm this move from producing in Japan to producing in the US. This exodus is happening. Toyota is also investing $1.4 billion to start building EVs in their Indiana plant. This is great for the US. More jobs will be created, US output will increase, and more taxes for the federal government. But domestically, this isn't good for Japan. Trump's plan is going to industrialize the US at the expense of their ally. And here's the problem for the yen. If Toyota decides to keep the dollars in the US, this poses a very big issue. Fewer dollars will circulate around Japan, and this will put even more pressure on the yen. So more currency devaluation and US Treasury sales are coming. We might not like America's beggar thy neighbor strategy, but chances it will work on Japan. We can expect them to dump even more US bonds, not because Japan is trying to de-dollarize, but because they simply need the money to rescue the yen. Looking at current holdings, we can see Japan still stands out as the biggest holder of all US debt, over a trillion in treasury bonds, 270 in agency bonds, and 325 billion in corporate bonds. Right now, the sell-off is in US government treasuries. But if the pressure continues, more US assets could get sold off. If Japan loses appetite, this is a big problem for US bond sales. Yields will move higher because they are losing a big inelastic buyer. Central banks like Japan, they buy US bonds to sit on them as reserves and collateral. But now you have a new breed of bond buyers who will demand more yield to hold US paper. This chart from the Federal Reserve tells us a disturbing trend building since the Fed started their rate hikes. The biggest buyer of treasuries today are households and foreign hedge funds, and these are some of the nastiest buyers around if you are the US government. They would dump their holdings in a heartbeat if they sense something is wrong with the US economy or fiscal policy. In other words, US bonds are now very much more volatile. State Street did a study on how much yields have to rise to absorb the flood of bonds coming from the US government, especially when countries like Japan and China are dumping their holdings. The CBO estimates at least 2 trillion a year will be issued in US debt, so it's a $20 trillion increase over the next decade. To absorb this tsunami of bonds, the 5-year yield will rise by almost 100 basis points above historical levels. It's a big reason why borrowing costs today are still elevated. Even though Powell is cutting rates on the short end, the market demands a higher yield to hold this time bomb. And with Trump coming to office, this debt crisis is going to get worse. Remember what he's promising: big infrastructure building, tax cuts, and military spending. All this is going to balloon the debt even further. It's important we look at his track record. In his first term, Trump's policies pushed the national debt up by $8.4 trillion over 10 years. In contrast, his tariffs only reduced the debt by $450 billion. That's a 20 times difference we can't ignore. This begs the question: if he tariffs the world, causing more countries to dump US bonds, won't that trigger a bigger explosion in US debt? You have to spend billions and trillions to build back US manufacturing, and this borrowing will be done at higher interest rates. Remember, it doesn't matter how much the Fed cuts rates, yields are determined ultimately by the free market. And with countries like Japan and China refusing to buy additional bonds, this snowballs the debt crisis even further. And here's how crazy things are. In 2024, the net interest payments on the national debt hit nearly $900 billion. This amount is more than either Medicare or defense spending, and by 2034, interest payments will far exceed defense by $700 billion. It will be the third biggest ticket item for the US budget. It's highly possible that by the end of Trump's term, the debt will explode well beyond 40 trillion, maybe even $45 trillion. Japan dumping US bonds is a clear warning. US economic policy could cause chaos in 2025 and beyond. Not only will the debt continue to rise, but exports to the US could also collapse. And this could cause yet another dollar shortage and trigger a new currency crisis next year. But let me know what you think. Will Japan continue dumping their bonds? And will the new US economy cause the world to sell off even more debt? Let me know in the comments below. Stay safe, be sure to smash the like button and subscribe as we navigate through these crazy times.